I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush. I made sure that it's nice and damp to condense my bristles, and now I'm going to take quite a bit of titanium white and move that to a clean spot here on my palette. Then I'm going to take the corner of that brush, grab the smallest hint of cadmium red light hue, and I'll mix that together to make a very soft pink. Might grab just a hint more. And we're mixing quite a bit of this because we have a lot of sky to cover. Now initially this will blend quite softly with the white in the background. It won't look like a stark pigment, and you probably won't pick up on the saturation, but in just a little bit, when we start incorporating our other darker colors, this will become significantly more noticeable. So it's important that in this step right here, you don't start to kind of overcompensate and make it significantly more red or saturated than it needs to be. I think when we see a delicate color like this on white, generally we say, oh, that doesn't stand out the way I want it to. But against the white, it's not really meant to. So don't let that fool you. With that said, I'm starting kind of right here in the middle. I'm working my way up, I'm working my way down a little bit, but this is essentially the pigment that we're going to have in the middle of the sky. I'm going to move it up to about this point right here. Just grabbing a bit more water so that my pigment has a good wet life, stays wet a little bit longer, and I'll continue throwing these pigments together. Now I'm going to head right up here with a bit of a darker color. So I'll take a hint of that red, a lot of titanium white, a small hint of blue. Now we're going to start changing that pink to a purple, a little bit more, and a small hint of Mars Black. Mars Black is a very strong pigment, so you really don't need much of it. I'm also mixing this on top of / beside our initial mixture. That way I can see what it'll look like blended in and with that first application. So here you can see that it's quite a dramatic change. I'm going to start applying this to all sides and edges, and I'm going to start blending it down into our initial mixture very softly. So I'm not applying much pressure at all with my brush. The more pressure you apply, the more streaky it will get. So we just want this to be nice and soft. And we want a subtle gradient so you don't see that there are two different colors, it just looks like a single pigment. Now we'll continue to get a little bit higher, but I'll get you a little bit closer so you can see the brush strokes. So now, yet again, we are going to continue to make this mixture a little bit more blue and a little bit darker. So we add some Mars Black, some Cerulean blue, and now we have this nice grayish blue mixture, which I'll start applying right up here. Now again, as you'll notice, it's not all that saturated. It really doesn't need to be. We're going to have a lot of vibrant pigments in our clouds, in the sunset area, and this is kind of just meant to complement it visually. We don't want the top of the painting to be too distracting and lead the viewer's eyes away. Here you can see I'm mixing it down into that pinkish purple, bringing it back up. Incorporate a bit on the left and right hand side. Do a nice little blend. And now yet again, more cerulean blue, More Mars Black. Getting nice and dark. This would be great for a vignette effect. And remember, we like to use vignettes because they draw the eye to the center of the painting, and that's where they keep the viewer's attention so it doesn't wander off the piece or necessarily get bored. There we go. Now this, of course, was only our first layer. And acrylic paints are innately semi-transparent, so if you find that you can still see your drawing underneath, or you feel like you can see the white of the canvas underneath, I would implore you to go back and do another layer once it's dried. And that will honestly just help you get better at mixing, blending, applying paint, because the more you do something, the more you learn about it, and the better you get. Here I'm going back and I'm just adjusting this to be a little bit darker, maybe a little bit more blue. So I'm still working in that mixture, and here you can kind of see how the sky's progressed, which is interesting. So I ended up going over the sky a couple more times, just building up those layers, making sure that canvas and those drawings weren't showing through. But in the process, I actually did lose the entirety of the drawings over here on the left-hand side and a couple over here on the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this dry completely, then I'll go back in, sketch it out, and continue from there. With that though, while we're letting this dry, I really would recommend going and cleaning your water and your brushes, because our next step is going to be working in the sunset down here. It's going to have a lot of orange in it, which is going to be comprised of yellow. And if we mix a yellowish pigment in our bluish water, we'll probably get something a bit more muddy on our brush, and it'll probably lean a little green, which we don't want in this piece. So let your painting dry, clean your brushes, clean your water, and then we'll come right back to this and continue a really nice little sunset. So I drew back in my clouds, and now I'm taking a 1/2 inch damp filbert brush, some of my cadmium yellow deep hue, about twice as much cadmium red light hue, and then quite a bit of titanium white. This will give us a nice orange that leans slightly to red. And I'll start applying that right down here along my horizon line. Now the filbert brush doesn't have any sharp edges to it, so working your way across that horizon line you might not get the sharpest of applications, but that is okay. Don't worry about that right now. You can always clean that up later when you're applying the actual water. But I'm applying it to the bottom here, giving myself a nice thick application. Work it up right in between some of these clouds. And then we need to start blending it up here. I'm going to do so by taking a little bit more yellow and quite a bit more white. See that? It's a little bit warmer. I'll start by applying that in our pre-existing applications, making sure we have a nice blend from one to the other, and then I'll just start working this up very softly in the sky, but I'm not going to go too far with it. This is essentially warm clouds on the horizon. We really don't want the yellow working its way up to anywhere where we have the blue. And I might just work a little bit more of this back. But as you can see, this area is predominantly the more yellowy orange, and this is more of the red. Now I'm going to take that pigment off my brush. And you know what? We can grab a little bit of purple. So red, blue, about an even mixture of the two. They are pretty balanced pigments. Good amount of titanium white, and then about half that of Mars black. This is going to give us a nice grayish purple. And we can incorporate some clouds down here. I do want it to be a bit brighter, so I'm going to take that pigment off my brush, get more titanium white, work that in, and we'll give this a shot. Don't go with the first pigment you mix if it's not what you want it to be. So I'm going to apply this along the horizon. As you can see, I'm not getting a perfectly sharp line because of my brush. That is okay. I'll start blending up a little bit, and then I'll create a little pitter-patter effect here for some clouds. The tops of them, they'll be a bit softer, they're far away. Can't really see that sharp detail from here. But that looks pretty good. It'll also make a lot more sense once we start painting in the rest of our clouds. And we are going to start doing that, but I'm switching my brush. Here I have a round pointed brush, and I'm using this because it doesn't have any real sharp edges, and it does have this nice little point for any wispy areas of clouds. So great brush for this sort of thing. I'm going to begin by making it nice and damp. We will mix a bit of a slightly darker purple than what we have there, because we want these clouds to be a little bit closer to us, so they're going to have less light working through them. And this is how we're going to start establishing depth. We have that cloud right there. It's very far away. It has a bit of a softer look. Now the clouds that I'm about to incorporate are closer to us. They have less light working through them, and so they'll stand out more. Here you can see I started with that larger stroke, and then it really started to taper in as we moved over to the right hand side. It's a real benefit of a brush like this. Can do a lot with it. Start working my way up over here. Back, I'm just following my reference photo, but if you're not working from a reference photo, I just recommend trying to make sure that your cloud is consistently diverse, that you have some longer areas, and when you do, it tapers to one side or another, that it builds into other portions of cloud. And we're going to have a bit of a pinkish red cloud right here behind it. So I'm not going to worry too much about my edges right now, as I will have to go back in and play with these in a couple of minutes. Right now I'm just kind of blocking in where I want everything to be. I have my sketch, and that's helpful, but I think if you've painted quite a bit, there's a difference between line art and fully pigmented full art, and sometimes they don't translate beautifully into one another. So sometimes you need to take artistic liberties. Here I made the purple a little bit stronger because we're now moving closer to us. This is farther away from this. So here we get darker, we get more saturated, and we build up that contrast. I do want to connect them, so we'll grab that. I'll mix in a little bit more white. That way we have a nice transitional purple between this and this. There we go. Blend one down into the other. And that's a good start. I think we'll get closer for the next step. Now, as you can see, this is a little bit thin. It definitely needs more layering, but I'm going to do this first, so I'm going to have to go back and do more of this, which is why I'm allowing that to be a little bit more thin right now. And with that, our next cloud is going to predominantly be red and white. So we'll mix these two together. Get a nice pink there, and then I'll grab the smallest hint of our yellow. We'll just continuously mix it until we get what we want. I think that's quite beautiful. And it needs to be darker than the oranges and pinks we have down here. So that's what we've achieved. That's what we want. And now I'm going to start moving this out. You can see I'm using the tip of the brush to create some sharper points to the clouds, but the majority of the cloud is a bit softer. You can also work this back over the purple if you want to change the cloud structure a little bit. There we go. Work it back in there. Starting to really diversify our colors, despite the fact that we're using very similar colors in our mixes. And this just goes to show that once you really get good at balancing your pigments, you can do so much with just a couple tubes of paint. You don't have to go out and buy, 1,000 colors. You can mix them with 5 or 6. There we go. Good start. You can see how easily this works over the Conte drawing. The water and the pigment just completely washes it away. Now, as I kind of move my head back, I do feel like this might be a little bit too red. So in my second layer, I'm going to adjust that. So by moving the camera back, we can see more of the colors working in conjunction with one another, and that's really important because you can mix an incredibly beautiful color, an example, this red, but if it doesn't work with the rest of the piece, you don't want it. So again, I am going to make changes to this. I'll start with red. I'll add a lot of white, more white probably than I did before because I do want it to be brighter. There we go. Definitely more pink heavy now. And then we'll grab more of our yellow, work that in. It's quite nice. Yeah. You can see the hint of the previous mixture right beside. So I'm comparing, I'm contrasting, I'm making sure that I do, in fact, like this more. And then we'll go back and I'll start predominantly on the edges of my cloud. That way I can see this new pigment working with the colors that it's going to actually be beside. If we started in the middle here, we wouldn't really have any reference because we're going to cover all of that red hypothetically anyway. Here you can see it's a bit of a softer transition into the yellow and orange, which I actually like a lot. If the red from the first layer isn't fully dry, then you are going to have a little bit of a mix, and it won't be exactly what you had on your palette. Something to consider, you may want to let it fully dry, but you may also want that mix. It's up to you. You also might have been entirely happy with your first application, and if you are, don't feel like you need to change it just because I am. There we go. Quite a bit of pigment on my brush here, so I'm just working this out into all of the different areas I know we're going to want it. Like that. I love that color. With the very soft purplish pink that we have there, I think that's just gorgeous. And now I'll work that back here. A little bit behind this cloud as well. So far, so good. Going to now take a bit of that pigment off my brush because it was quite high on the bristles, and at a point it would become more difficult to apply that paint. So now that that's done, I'm going to continue working with this because I have quite a bit of it. I'm happy with it, and we do have spots over in other clouds where it will be quite useful. So I'm just going to start working on this kind of connector cloud. As you can see here, a little bit more there. And here you can see a real contrast between the pigments. This one mixed with the original red, this one just natural by itself. Quite neat to see. And you can of course make this into that by just continuously layering more of this pigment. As it builds up over time, you'll see less and less of that red underneath. There we go. You can see just how soft this is right now. And we're going to have a lot of this pigment working its way around the edges because this is our highlight pigment. And as we get more into the center of our clouds like this one, that it's going to get significantly darker as less light can move into it, as it is a more thick pigment. So right now we are just working in the areas where light will be able to pass through more thin areas of the clouds. And that's predominantly along the edges. Mostly down here, but there are going to be hints of that highlight up here as well. And we'll have to do a number of layers to build this up, but right now, again, we're kind of just blocking things in, figuring out where we want highlights, how much of them we want. You can see I kind of played with the sketch there. Oh, I like that. I really like that. Good. Okay, so I have a little bit left. I have a little bit more of an area in which I want it. Just looking at my reference photo, but I'm not feeling like I have to follow it to a T. I am taking artistic liberties when I feel the piece could work a little bit better, or maybe not necessarily better, but just towards my subjective likings. It's a good thing to remember. Art isn't ever innately, inherently good or bad. It's very subjective. Different people like different things, and that's okay. It's actually one of the great things about art, I think. There we go. So from there, we are going to jump back into the darker pigments, into the purples, and we'll take some of our red, our blue, again about an even mixture of the two. It's going to give us the ideal coloring. We'll take some titanium white, but not that much. Take a hint of Mars black because we want the black and white to desaturate the rest of the pigment a little bit. That way it isn't too prominent. And I'll give this a test down here in a previously applied purple. What am I learning? This is a little bit darker than what I had here. It's not a bad thing. I like that. As you move higher up, it does need to get darker. Here I'll just let it dissipate into the back. Create a bit more depth there. And you know what? I did like it, so let's grab more of it. And we'll start working our way up here in the cloud. I want a relatively soft blend between this and the peachish orange. So I'm looking for a gradient. I'm spinning my brush in a lot of those blends. But we need significantly more pigment than that. So I tested it with a little bit. Generally don't like to mix a lot of pigment initially. Make sure that it's right the first time before you commit to a lot. There we go. And now we'll head in. Remember, doesn't have to be perfect. We'll probably do a couple of layers. But the closer you get it the first time, the easier it'll be the second. I think we'll work a bit more blue into that. And we're also going to fill in this cloud as well. So, that I don't waste your time here, I'm just going to fill these two in, and then we'll jump back into this with some new techniques and ideas. So I went ahead and I finished blocking in the majority of the clouds, but now it's time to start playing with some of the more fun detail-oriented stuff. And here we are going to need a bit more of that purple, so I'm taking an equal amount of blue and red. I'm taking a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, and we're just creating more of that purple that we had. This time I'm going to take all of that pigment off my brush because I used that brush to mix it, and there was quite a lot of pigment on there. We don't want much pigment on our brush, otherwise it'll be difficult to get the details you want. I also want to make sure that my brush is nice and damp. So now I'm going to grab just a very, very minuscule amount of pigment, and I'll start working on some clouds that are separated from our larger clusters. And these will generally come off in a series. So here we'll have a couple that are following this line. I'm using a lot of taps. I'm trying to make sure that there are very inconsistent movements and applications. Sometimes there will just be a tap, and you also want some of these to be less opaque than others. So this one, it's very soft. You can also go over some of the edges, make them softer. But the idea here is that we're diversifying what we have, because right now we have a lot of big blocky subjects in our painting, and we want details to soften that and to give it additional interest. So here, using quite a bit of water, we make this semi-transparent pigment, and we're able to interject lots of little clouds in here, like that. You can also take this pigment to go back over edges that we went over with portions of that red. So again, just building back up those purples and integrating small details whenever possible. Here I'll have a little cloud breaking off. It's a nice little detail. Here's another one. And I did two that are essentially horizontal applications, but they're done with a little bit of a tap, so they're different from one another. And that's an okay thing to do, but make sure you don't only do that. Here we'll make a piece that's kind of coming off. We'll have a small hint of light working its way through there. There we go. It's another good detail to have. It's also quite thin though, so we're going to want to go over it a couple of times. Sometimes when a pigment is very wet and it has quite a bit of water in it, it doesn't really matter how much pigment you add, it's going to still be soft for a while. So I'm going to let that dry and then I can come back over it. Here I'm just fixing up some previously applied edges, thickening that. And now we will grab more of that fairly transparent pigment, and we'll throw some clouds up into here, like so. The more times you go over a certain cloud like this, the more dense and opaque it will get. You can also soften things by just doing a little finger painting, as you saw there. Say this in a lot of lessons, but never get too old to finger paint. Still a very useful technique. You can see that I'm also leaving little brush strokes in there. And I'm trying to make a lot of the gradients and the soft to opaque patterns with the more opaque side up closer to the top and the softer area closer to the bottom here. It's a little detail, but it will give you some additional depth in your painting. I'm also going to work a little bit of a purple over top portions of this orangish pink. Very soft here. Create a whole new type of transparent wispy cloud. And that's what you generally want in pieces that have a lot of sky. You want different types of clouds. The more you have there, the more diverse it is, the more interesting it can be, and the longer it can generally hold a viewer's attention. There we go. So far, so good. See how this significantly more opaque cloud is now in front of the softer cloud, and then there are these other opaque clouds that are in front of it. It's another good way of creating a bit of extra depth and detail on the piece. But right now we do have a lot of messy edges because we applied this really nice pink, then we applied this really nice purple. We didn't ever blend them, we didn't try to make them cohesive, we just kind of put the colors in there. So now we're going to go back and balance it with quite a bit of red, quite a bit of white, a little bit of yellow. Try to get something relatively similar to what we had previously along those edges, like that. And I have a lot of pigment on my brush, as you can tell. If you feel like you have too much after that mixture, you can always take it off. So here I'm continuing to work this highlight along my edges. Like so, we're building it up in a couple of different areas. And soon we're going to blend it with some actual purple. But I want to apply a fair amount of wet pigment right now. That way it doesn't dry when I'm mixing my next pigment. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to take that pigment off my brush, going to grab some red, blue, bit more titanium white than we've used before in a previous purple, a little bit more red than we've used before in our previous purple, and significantly less Mars black. Now I'll start applying this along these edges, and our goal is to be quick so that we can blend our pinkish orange into this lighter purple. That way it looks like there is this secondary lighter pigment in our clouds. And I'm kind of dancing around with it. I'll leave open dark spots like that. Try to get a bit of a soft blend into the rest of it. Like so. And it is still wet. So now I'm going to take that pigment off my brush. A lot of jumping around here. Grab more of that peach orange, and you can actually blend the two together at this point. So we're bringing that light inwards, getting rid of hard edges, making things nice and soft when we want them to be. Oh, I love this. Took a couple steps to get here, but now that we are here, it was so worth it. Love these colors together. Here you can see I'm working some of this pink inside, and then this way I have a bit of a sharp edge, and then I'm blending it back. That way it looks like this part of the cloud protrudes, comes out in front of this other part of the cloud. Wasn't in the reference photo, but I thought it could look really neat. There we go. And just like that, our cloud really starts to come together. Let me show you this from a distance, and we can do this one from a distance. That way you can see how all of those colors are working kind of again cohesively with the rest of the piece. Okay, so now we're going to head over into this cloud and make it three-dimensional like this cloud. We will start, yet again, by mixing up a good amount of our nicer orangey peach, just like that. get a good amount ready, and I'll start working in on those edges, just like this. Doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. We will be coming back to it in just a second. Remember, we need this base layer to blend with, and we're going to try to work relatively quickly. That way it doesn't all dry first. There we go. You know what? I might move a little bit more in. I didn't have this in the reference photo, but again, artistic liberties can really help a piece. So, step 1, apply that. Step 2, we're going to take blue, white, red, slightly more red than blue, a little bit of Mars black, and we'll start working closest to the sun, and then we'll work our way backwards. As we do this, we are blending with those pinks and oranges. We're letting our pigment dissipate as we get up closer to the top where we want it to be a little bit darker. But we can also do that later. There we go. Off to a good start. Now I'm going to clean my brush, take all of that pigment off, grab more of our pink, our orange, whatever yours may be, and we'll work that back in, this time creating a bit more of a larger application. Initially we're kind of doing outlines around the edge, but in this application we are really starting to bring it inwards. Again, we want all of these highlights at the bottom because that is where they are closest to facing the sun. And we'll slowly work our way up as we run out of pigment. It's important, I think, to do some of this really close to the canvas, that way you can see the detail, but also some of it quite far away, that way you can see how it's all working together with the rest of the piece. If you need an area to be a bit brighter or darker, if you need a certain blend to be softer or to show more brush strokes. And you're only going to get all of that information by looking at your painting in a variety of depths, different perspectives. Going in and I'm softening some of these more pink edges just because they were a little bit hard and we want our clouds to look a little bit more loose here. There we go. Create quite a bit of this highlight up at the top, and I'll have it kind of work its way over there. Now I'm probably going to spend another half an hour or so just doing little details, touch-ups, doing the same things down here. But once all of this is done, we will continue to progress together. Oh, I love that. I always say things like that where I'm going to go ahead and do this, and then you know what, I get completely wrapped up in something and I say, you know what, I really want you to see this too. So maybe we'll stick together on this portion for a little bit longer. I know I'm having a lot of fun. Oh, okay, actually, you know what, good tip. We applied this pinkish red down here at the bottom a couple of times. Something you might want to do, because it's a pinkish red cloud as a whole, is create a slightly lighter pinkish red. So just more titanium white in that mixture. And go along the edges That way, even these clouds have a bit more depth. These ones, you create the depth by moving that pinkish red into the purple, but with clouds that are just naturally pinkish red, you don't want them to look flat either. So with these, find the edges, add a slightly lighter pigment, work it inwards, and you can even make that edge a little bit less opaque. So you have a transition and a gradient from a very soft cloud to something that is a bit more dense in the middle. Once we're done with our sky, we're going to move down into this landmass right here. I'm going to continue to use this brush because I do like the nice little sharp point to it, and it can pick up a relatively good amount of pigment. Here I am going to mix another purple. However, this purple is going to be by far the darkest purple we have mixed, so significantly more Mars Black in this, and I'm mixing it right beside our previous purple. That way I have a good reference point. I will still grab a hint of titanium white because we don't want it to be too saturated or too dark, but we do still want it to be the darkest purple we've rendered. So here you can see I'm starting on the top of the edge here because generally when you have new pigment on your brush and your brush is damp, you have the most clean pigment, the best opportunity to create sharp lines. And so here I'm creating all of these little trees, and I can only do this because I still have quite a bit of pigment on my brush. If I used a lot of it like this, and I went to try to do that, my stroke would be significantly larger and I wouldn't get that detail. So, whenever you need to do a lot of detail, do it initially when you have that new pigment, and then when you start to run out, fill in an area like that. I'm going to dampen my brush, grab a bit more, come back in. And my reference photo doesn't have all of these trees, but again, I want the detail. There we go. I did lose the landmass under a lot of paint, so I will be kind of coming up with this myself here. We could always go back in, check the reference photo, redraw it, but I'm fairly confident with what I have in mind. So we have it getting lower here until eventually we are at the water. And now I can just take that extra pigment and work that back in. It's like a silhouette, but it isn't a pure black. It still has those colors reflecting from the sky, and I'm also going to leave very small little openings occasionally to let that light show through open areas in these distant trees. I'll also allow this area to be a little bit more thin than this because we have more light working its way through here, which will illuminate that area, where this side is opposite to the light and therefore will have a lot of shadows and be quite dark. There we go. Now I'm just filling in that back, that middle. The bottom area should still be quite opaque because it will have a bit of a shadow, but this top area can be more thin. And we'll go over this a couple of times just to thicken it. So here we have our sky fully filled in, including this little patch right here, and I have to say, I'm always astonished by how just a little area like that can really fill it in and make it feel complete. At this point, I am very happy with our sky. I don't feel like it's too detailed at this point, and that's an important thing. If we want to go back in and add additional detail later, we can. But as a general rule, I don't like to add too much to my skies before I do the foreground. Because if we add a massive amount of detail back here, then we're kind of forcing ourselves to add even more so down here, and we might not want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now start working on this water in the distance, and once we have this area done, we might go back and touch that up. But even if we don't, I'm very, very pleased with it right now. So now I'm going to switch back to my 1-inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp, and we're going to work in the farthest area of the water and then move forward. So here I'm going to start with a very dark purple, not as dark as this, but a little bit darker than what we had in our clouds. So we'll use quite a bit of blue, good amount of Mars black, equal amount of red as we have blue, and then some titanium white, of course. And just like that, we do have something right in between those two purples that we've previously mixed. Quite happy with that. So I'm going to brace my hand on the canvas. I'll probably use my pinky finger, rest it on a clean spot, and then I'll work with a myriad of small strokes horizontally until we have a nice clean line. It's generally easier to do this with a lot of little streaks than it is to do a single one. But if you're really finding this troublesome, something you can do, that makes it really easy, is take some green painter's tape, apply it right there, and then just paint over it, then peel off the tape. With that said, I'm quite happy with the line we just rendered, and so now I'm going to take that pigment and I'm going to start working it down. Then as I get over to the other side here, I will just continue that line, and we'll bring this down until we get to this next change in water. So this is kind of its own area, then we have a little bit of a wave. Talk about how to do that in just a minute, but now we'll give this a nice flat application. I find water can be really intimidating if you look at it as a whole, but if you can kind of separate it in between waves and different values, it can be significantly more friendly. So that is our start. We have a simple strip of dark purple, and now it's time to start building in some highlights. So I'm going to switch back to the pointed round-headed brush, and we will make some of the pink that we have here in the sky. I say pink, it does have a hint of yellow in it still. Now I'm going to start with something a little bit darker, as you can see, and we'll slowly build it up. But I'm going to say, okay, the light, it's coming predominantly from here. Oh no, did not mean to do that. Oh my, that does happen. Taking all of the pigment off my brush, so it's just water, and just like that, we take it off. And I added more. Okay, you know what? I feel like a lot of people would take this out. I feel like it'd be embarrassing, but I think it's important. It happens to all of us, it's okay. And, you know, only by seeing these things happen do you know how to fix them, right? So, there we go. Okay, back to being clean. Important to show our flaws. We aren't all perfect and we all make mistakes, and that's okay. With that, I am now going to head back in here, and as you can tell, when I apply this pigment, it mixes with that purple. So, we don't get the pigment on our palette, we get a mixture. And that's okay. That again is actually what we want. It's going to give us a lot more of a subtle transition. It's also worth noting that we're using a very, very minimal amount of yellow in this mixture right now because we are working on top of a pigment that has a wet blue in it. And remember, those two don't mix well if you're working on a piece with a lot of these colors, because it'll start working in greens and it's probably not what you want. So here, as you can see, I'm making lots of little horizontal strokes, blending this highlight out from the middle over to the left-hand side where I want it to dissipate and get darker. I'll grab a bit more of that pigment. I'll start here, again in that brightest point, and now I'll work my way to the right. I'm going to let the top of this line be a little bit dark, more so than the body of the water here. And I think when you paint, you learn not to leave outlines on things, especially when you have darker underlayers. But this is one of the few scenarios where it actually looks correct and makes sense. So this is a one-time thing. We are going to leave a little bit of that outline. And yet again, as we move to the right, we let it dissipate, we run out of pigment, it's blending, and the purple is almost fully dry at this point, so I'm not blending wet into wet, I'm blending wet into dry, which can be difficult, but because my brush is nice and damp, it lets my pigment become more transparent as I run out of pigment. Just becomes more watery, and therefore you can see more of that purple underneath, and it creates the illusion of a blend, and it does create a true optical blend. So here now you have that area in the middle, it's brighter, and that's really what we want to build up and play with. So I'll take more of that. Now that we have a bit more of a pink base, I can incorporate a little bit more yellow, and we can incorporate more and more yellow as that purple dries. But we do still need to be careful with it. There we go. Beautiful. That's what we want. We have the colors from underneath showing through, which is really nice. This is one of those things that's best done in a number of layers and while you take your time. I know a lot of you probably found me from the 10-minute painting lessons, but I really do want to stress that you don't need to paint quickly. You're not a better painter if you paint more quickly than someone else. If you can take your time and do things as well as you can, that's a wonderful thing. There we go. Starting to capture some magic here. There we go. So from there, I think we'll move down into our first wave. We can go back up and correct that a little bit later, but again, much like the sky, I just want to see how much detail will build up, and then we might go back and add more in a couple of places. But for this first wave here, we want a significantly darker pigment. I'm going to stick with this brush because I like the amount of control and detail it provides me, and I'm going to make this significantly darker and more blue. So I will look for the purple we were just working with. I'll add more blue to it, then red this time. There we go. Good. And I'll apply that right under our highlight. Good. Connect it up into the top area over on the right hand side. Again, it adds to the vignette effect. And you can soften the edge a little bit on the top if you want by just going over it very softly. I like to do that a little bit on the edges. That way they do look more soft and the eye goes more towards the center area. So that'll be the top of our wave, and we'll make it a little bit wider, that way we have a little bit of pigment to blend with. But that initial application was essentially as wide as we're going to want it in the end. So that's good right there. I'm also going to create another wave. So we'll mix up a bit more of that pigment. And this one will dip right under it, and it will be on the left-hand side here. Good. I think we'll probably continue another one. We have this little spot in between here. So I'm just trying to create a lot of diversity with my waves, with the width of them, with where they are placed. There we go. Okay, quite happy with that. So now we take more pigments like this and we work them in between. Then we can go back and add the highlights and the details to the wave. So here I'll grab more of that nice pinkish orange, find the middle, apply it right in there, test it up there. So far so good. Of course, we don't have the darker purple base right now, and I didn't apply that because I didn't want it to conflict with the waves. So we'll just mix this to be a bit darker. So I'll grab that pigment, I'll move it down, grab some extra Mars black, work it in, a little bit of extra blue, a little bit of extra red. Blue, white. And this is just a spot you might want to spend a little bit of extra time problem solving, going back, adjusting things. Just like that, we've honestly got it. We're in a good place here. Okay, so still a subtle transition, still looking quite good. And now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. It is the same type of brush, it's just a little bit more tiny. And I'm going to get you a bit closer and we'll start working on the tops of those waves. So here we are, up close. My brush is nice and damp, and now I'm going to look at that dark pigment that I used for the waves. I'll incorporate some extra blue and titanium white into it. Create something a little bit brighter, but not bright, just bright relative to what we had. I'll go into the tops, and then I'll start working down with a stroke like this. This wave is in the distance, so it's going to be very subtle. You're not going to see a lot of change in it. And I'll also trail that highlight off the edge, because that darker application that we initially applied, that's the underside of the wave. It's not getting much light, but the top of the wave is going to be a little bit brighter. And we don't want it to be a massive contrast, because this still is quite far away and we want to save those contrasts more for our foreground. But this is a great way to practice. That way we know what we're doing when we are in the foreground and we are building the areas that people are really going to notice. There we go. I'm also going to now create a second highlight of it. Again, not a dramatic difference. Keep it subtle. Don't want it to be actually bright yet. But we'll just do a little bit of a tap at the top. Make it look like there's a little bit of water falling, a little bit of light hitting the tops of this wave. But because it's so far away, it's really just the impression of a wave. It's not hyper detailed rendering of one. Here I'm going back with a damp brush and just softening a couple areas. And now I'll grab some of that pinkish peach that we used at the bottom, and I'll just work my way up that wave a little bit with horizontal strokes, leaving little openings. That way we have a nice little transition area. And you can bring that back down here just in case that pigment's a little bit different. You can also go back to the darker wave pigment and create slightly more of that dark color should you feel you may have incorporated a little bit more highlight than you wanted. Again, it's just about finding the balance you like. Now, because the next area we're going to be working on is so large here, I am switching back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and yet again, we are going to make some purple. It's not going to be as dark as before, as what we had in the waves, but it'll be relatively dark, and we'll just build our base layer in the same way that we did before. So there we go. Start this on the edges, like that. Work our way in, like that, going over the bottom of the darker side of the wave that we had from before. As you can tell, it's pretty watery by just how transparent it is. So how do we get around that? We simply work in more pigment. There we go. So far, so good. I think we'll add a hint more blue to that. And just like that, we have a nice, clean base layer. From there, I will clean that brush relatively well, just dip it in some water, wipe off the excess paint, and I'll switch back to our larger to medium-sized round-headed brush with the tip, and I'll start making a nice highlight. The first highlight needs to be almost without yellow. We can add just the smallest hint, but it really needs to be pink dominant. We say, okay, the light's here, this is the brightest spot. Let's add that in and start working our way in both directions. We want a fairly consistent change there and there. There we go. And of course, we'll have to go back and do this a couple of times. If we need to, we can always go back and increase the size of the wave right behind us as well. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes refining this area, and then we'll work on the next wave together. So I've went ahead and brightened that, but now it's time to go back in and add those highlights. So here I do have that smaller tipped round-headed brush. We are going to look at the purples that we have here. I'm going to add a bit more blue than we normally do. We'll add a bit of white, and remember, this needs to be brighter than the wave, but not actually bright. So we're looking for something probably right around there. I'll give this a test. I'll head into the top of the wave, and this is actually really nice. This is a subtle starting pigment. I'm working my way along the edge, and it's barely noticeable at this point, which is really what you want if you're going to build a lot of depth and have a lot of variety in your pigments. So now that we have our first layer in there, we'll take a little bit more titanium white, not much, and we'll head back into the top, just like that. Get a bit more pigment, and we'll just keep playing with it. You notice that a lot of these strokes are horizontal, but when I feel like I have a bit more space to play, like in the middle here, I might also do a little bit of a tap downwards to show that the water is starting to move in that direction. This one is too far away to notice that sort of detail, but as we get closer, we get more of an opportunity to play with that. There we go. Grab a bit more. I think we'll add just a hint over to this wave right here, and some right over here as well. But I'll let this be darker. It gets a little bit darker there, so it's not a consistent line all the way across. There are spots that get bright and dark, and that inconsistency makes it look significantly more natural. So, good little start there. I am going to take some of the darker pigment mixed with the brighter pigment, and now we'll start creating some smaller little changes in the water right down here. We'll do another one right here. And what I'm doing is I'm essentially creating a more thick, opaque middle area. Then I'll have it taper towards the edges. Then maybe I'll have another one. So it'll get thick and then smaller. But I'm making lots of little taps. It's not a continuous stroke. And this is a way of adding some extra detail, showing some smaller waves that might just be building, or the remnants of those which have just crashed. It's great little accent pieces either way. Because it's in the distance, you really can't see much detail, which can be really nice or really annoying depending upon the type of painting personality you have. If you have the need to add detail to everything, this part might be a little bit frustrating. Might frustrate you a little bit, but for those of you who feel like we've done a lot of detail already, or you just want to warm up for the detail, this is probably great for you. I find I get in different moods. Sometimes I want a lot of detail, sometimes I want to just be a bit more loose with my applications. Right now I'm pretty happy either way though. You can also take hints of this and work it up into the background here once you have a very watery brush, and you can make it subtle. Okay? Grab a little bit more, starting to run out. Just some little taps over here. And this is where we start to build really nice changes. Take some yellow, take some red, take quite a bit of titanium white, like that. And we want this to be slightly brighter than what we already have. Say, okay, you know what, we'll incorporate some of this nice orangish pink right into there, following that light down. Working my way around some of those darker spots we just incorporated, like that. I think we'll add just a hint more red to it. Work my way back. Little taps, leaving areas in between. Here you can see the pigment wasn't as consistent. I have a little bit of red and orange. I actually like that a lot. So here we're just going back and building. Make it more red this time. And by continuously going back with these very tiny little strokes rather than long blends, we're able to get the feel of waves in the distance. It's a bit more choppy, but you can only do this once you've built up that full base that we have. So we start with something a bit more simple, and then we expand into this detail. Over here I'm just doing more of that tap, similar to what we did with the darker pigments, to create a different look. It's almost spotted over here. So now I'm going to take the larger pointed brush and we're going to start working on the next set of waves. These, however, are going to be a bit larger. They're going to be kind of working their way up onto the shore, and so we do want this brush because we do want to deliver quite a bit of pigment. We're going to start with a little bit of red, a bit more blue, then red, good amount of Mars black. We want the base layer to be quite dark, and a hint of titanium white to thicken and desaturate it. Then I will start just blocking in the heads of these rolling waves. I noted that they'd be bigger than these. These are actual waves that are kind of crashing. These are the remnants washing up on shore. So they're not actually physically bigger waves, but they're visually bigger because they're closer to us, and that's just what perspective does. But recognize here that we aren't going to be painting traditional waves. It's something I've been thinking about making a tutorial on, really focusing on that. But I also feel like there are a lot of really fantastic tutorials on a basic wave on YouTube, and I want to make new things. I want to provide something that hasn't really been done before or painted before. So I don't know, I'm a little apprehensive about the idea, but it's definitely a possibility. It'll probably work its way into a piece sometime, but again, I do want to play with different color palettes. I want to offer you different scenes that aren't just a regular clear blue day with a big wave washing up on the beach. I think those scenes are beautiful. I think they're wonderful. I think they're amazing tutorials on YouTube. I want to give you something a little different and something you can really learn a lot from, sink your teeth into, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. So there we have the heads of the water that is going to be rushing in. Now we're going to work on the insides. I want it to be a bit brighter. I do want it to be purple leaning, red and blue. That's good. And I want a relatively sharp line between this, and I want a soft transition from this into this. So at the bottom here, I'm doing a blend, but as I get towards the top, I'm doing a very small blend. So I'm letting these pigments mix with these pigments, but it's a very tight movement back and forth, where this is much more loose, and I'm grabbing a lot more pigment and moving it about. The more I do of this, the more I feel like it should be just a bit more purple, so we'll work some extra red back into there. There we go. And this is, of course, just the darker layer like we built here and here. With that, I'm going to continue applying it, and then we will hop into the details together. So, as you can see, I now have that nice dark base layer worked in, and I'm going to make it a little bit more interesting by taking some added pink, just like that. It's not too bright, it's not too saturated, it's a fairly general pink. I'm going to find that main highlight area, and while this purple is still wet, I'm just going to work this subtly into that middle and then out on the edges. I don't want it to be prominent, I don't want it to be highly notable. This is just going to be a slight highlight that shows through some of our future layers, which are going to be quite different from what we did there, because we are now getting quite close and we're now going to be able to see a lot of detail. So this needs to be subtle. It's not meant to be as bright or saturated as that. We're just creating a simple gradient of bright to dark and to dark. So now we're going to get really quite close once all of this dries. Grab the smaller pointed brush, and we'll mix up quite a bit of blue with a hint of red, some titanium white, and a little bit of Mars black, because yet again we are going in and working on the highlights in the wave, but these highlights still aren't bright. So we will take this and we'll give it a go. I'm going to start by applying it to the tops of the wave, like that. I'm going to make sure my brush is nice and damp. Move my way over here. And then as I start to move down, I want it to get a little bit brighter. So add some extra titanium white. And we'll have that water start to move inwards. So it's falling from the top. It has different motions and movements. You want to make sure that they're always changing and diverse. And then as you get towards the bottom here of this little area, we're going to get more of that pigment, and we're going to create a little area where it's all kind of crashing and pooling. You can work this up into the rest of the wave, but this is essentially the opaque area that connects all of it. This is the consistency. This is also a technique that will look better and better the more time and the more detail you put into it. Because I'm filming a tutorial, I can only put too much time in, but you know, if you are willing to paint this over a week's time or what have you, you could definitely incorporate significantly more detail, and the larger the canvas you're working on, the more you can incorporate. But we're essentially creating a bit of a line at the top in a litany of strokes, a consistent line at the bottom that moves with the motions of the wave, and then pieces that come up and down, connecting the two occasionally, but just leading the eye from one to the other. There we go. Colors are really beautiful together. When your brush is extremely damp, you get the sharpest, smallest marks, and those are going to be ideal here. See that? Now, we're going to take that same pigment and we're going to start working on the foam that's happening down here. So I find that line, I'll make a connection, I'll move it out even more. You can tell that my pigment is extremely watery. A lot of it is semi-transparent. I'm trying to make some of these strokes very small, others larger. And I'm kind of working back and forth, creating different sized openings in different shapes. Get a hint more of a highlight here. Go over this one again. The more you go over them, the more noticeable and opaque they'll get. You don't want to do this to all of them because you do want that transparent effect here and there. But it really can be quite nice. And this is another thing where the more time you spend, the more you diversify, the better it will look. And of course, I will work this all the way across on both sides. Also go up here, touch that up again. This is one of the, in my opinion, most fun portions of the painting. It's just incredibly cathartic. Every little stroke, you feel like you're accomplishing something new and exciting. And I love that. Takes a while to build up to this point, but when you get here, it's just so rewarding. I'll also move little bits of it forward. We have the pink showing through the blue, always a beautiful color combination. There we go. And if you feel like you ever make any of them too wide, you can actually take a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, titanium white, hint of Mars black, not much. And you can go back in between and create additional little openings and spots there. So don't ever feel like you shouldn't do more or you're worried you might do too much, because you can always work backwards and layer this color back in and just kind of keep working with it until you have exactly what you want. You can also take a hint of that pink and work it back into the wave at the bottom, but I wouldn't do too much of that. So here's a little bit of a wide shot so you can see how all of that detail meshes in from afar and from a distance in which you generally look at a painting. Because I think when a lot of us paint, we paint quite close, and we forget that when someone goes to look at a painting, they're generally not going to be right up to it. So it's good to take some steps back and evaluate from here. With that said, as I do take these steps back, I notice that I want this wave to be extended maybe to right about there. That way we have some extra room for those details. And I might extend this one out to here as well. I'll do so with the same larger pointed round-headed brush. And I think I'd also like to take this opportunity to, as I try to do in every video, say a big thank you to the patrons who do support this channel. This channel is primarily fan-funded. It is a Wednesday and I am painting. It is because of you that I am able to paint like this on a Wednesday, that I'm able to make these tutorials and put these out. I wouldn't have the time. I'd be busy working another job, and I just wouldn't be able to do weekly lessons. So I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who does support the channel up over on Patreon. Without you, this lesson would not have happened, and I am incredibly grateful. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to do this. Thank you for providing the community with this lesson. I think because of you and your contribution, more people are going to find this, and people are going to be interested in painting and get the brushes out, come back to it after years, do all of these really wonderful things. So thank you for keeping art alive in my home and the home of many others. I know if you listen to the channel frequently, if you watch a lot of these videos, you probably hear that a lot, but I think it's really important that I say it a lot. I think it's really important that I say it in each and every episode, because again, these lessons, they don't happen. These episodes, they don't happen without that support. So truly thank you to everyone who does do that up there. If you are new to the channel and this is your first time hearing that, I do offer traceables and reference photos, bonus lessons, all 5 of my ebooks, an exclusive Facebook group up over on Patreon, lots of different perks for helping support the channel up there, and it's always incredibly appreciated. So if you're interested, there is a link in the video description. It's a great way of just, saying thank you for the lessons, but, I would like to say a big thank you to you as well for just being here today, watching this, getting this far, being a part of this artistic community. And here you can see that I'm going back into the waves with a little bit more of a highlight. I like this a lot. Slowly just building it up. I'm not going across the entirety of the top, but I'm kind of moving across, and I'm doing this from an afar right now. I don't want to be all that close because I think if I were to get really close, I'd start making all of it really bright, and I don't want that right now. I'm also going to switch over to the smaller round-headed brush, grab some extra blue, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, or red, and I'll head back in with these small little foam areas. And again, I want to film this a bit farther away because we did film it up close, and I do think it's important that you can see just how minimal this looks from afar. That way you know that we're really not adding too much. We're being selective. You can see how I'm jumping around from side to side. Generally, if you do one area and you just stick in it, you tend to start doing the same thing over and over again, and we don't want that. We want to instill a lot of diversity. So hopefully, from afar, it's just a little bit more notable of how much I am jumping around here, how thin the pigments are, because as I apply this line, it's probably difficult to see. And you'd think in a lesson it's not a good thing, but I think it is, because you do really notice how subtle this is and how subtle it's meant to be. There we go. Of course, we do need to go back into the tops of these and add more highlights like that, but with a little bit more detail. So here we are up close yet again, and I'm going to simply mix a bit more of that blue that we've been working with, like that. It's quite dark right now, it's quite gray, and that's a great place to start. So I'm going to take the extra pigment off my brush, because generally when you mix pigment with your brush, you build up a lot on the bristles, and it makes it difficult to deliver those clean, sharp strokes. So now that it's a bit more clean itself, I'm grabbing some of that pigment, and we're heading back in. I will make a bit of a transition, I think, onto this wave right here from our pre-existing blue lines. I don't think this one's really going to be rising all that much, and so we can kind of continue what we've previously established. I just took all of the pigment off my brush again, grabbed some more water, and I'm going to continuously keep my brush extremely damp through this process, because as long as it's damp, I can create those really sharp lines that I want. We are now closer in the painting than we've ever been, which means the detail needs to be sharper than it's been, and we need a bit more of it than we've incorporated in other areas, because the closer you get, the more the eye can see. We'll also head back into this one as well, and this is kind of an incomplete area in a relatively complete space, so it'll feel quite good to clean up and finish here. Just keep mixing that. Might be a little bright, but we will see. I'll give it a test. You know what? I actually like that a lot. It is bright, but I don't think it's too bright. There we go. So I created a bit of a line with this one, but I am going to work some lines backwards into the rest of the blue. And then I'll create some movements forward like this. We are, of course, blending wet onto dry right now, so it's very important that we have quite a bit of water on our brush. That way we get those smooth, transparent transitions. And I'll start going over some of the main larger movements there, and I'll add additional highlights to the top of it, and I'll let it soften as it moves back downwards. That way, it looks like we have some depth in the highlights. It's how you really create depth on just about anything. You add those dark values and you add the midtones on top, letting some of those dark values show through. Then you add light values on top of the mid values, letting some of the mid values show through. and it doesn't really change all that much. With that said, we did just talk about Patreon. We did just talk about the ebooks that I have up there, and one of them is Acrylics for Beginners. And I know I have a lot of new people coming into the channel right now. If you are unaware, I did write a book called Acrylics for Beginners. In it, it's essentially the essentials. It's everything you need to know as you jump into your first acrylic painting. And in it, we do talk about painting wet into dry. We do have lots of examples of how you wrap light around subjects to make things three-dimensional, and it's a great place to start. I also have a lot of books that are traceables, for those uninspired days, but I really do recommend, if you are up over on Patreon at that $8 tier, going ahead and reading it through, because there's a lot of great information that I feel like I'm just touching the surface on here with this painting. If you don't want to subscribe to the channel over on Patreon, I do also sell it individually up over on Etsy. It is an ebook, so you get to download it immediately. And I get a lot of questions about if I sell physical copies of it, and I do understand the desire for that, but I just think it works a lot better as an ebook, so I don't offer physical copies. It is something with a lot of graphs and paintings and diagrams and things that you really should be able to enlarge and zoom in on, which, being on a computer allows you to do, or being on a tablet or on a phone, but you can't really do that with a true physical book. So it is exclusively an ebook, but you can get it over on Patreon or on Etsy. It's entirely up to you. But it's got a lot of really useful information, should you be interested. I don't normally talk about it, but I feel like we covered a lot in the last 2 or 3 minutes that it focuses on, and I thought, you know what? Because there are a lot of new people, we should probably bring a little bit of attention to it. There we go. Really building up all of that detail. Now we'll create more highlight. Titanium white in with the blue. Something brighter. We'll go along the tops initially of some of the larger strokes. We're going to try to get the left-hand side over here, because the light's coming this way. The left-hand side is closest to the light, and then we'll have it kind of dissipate as you move towards the right-hand side. And it'll be the opposite over here, which I'll touch on more in a second. So I'm finding the left-hand side of these strokes. I'm applying this additional stroke, building it up. Now I'll head over into these, making sure my brush is nice and damp. And because the light's here, shining down this way, the right-hand side of these strokes is going to get that highlight and that extra light. So we're just switching it. Really starting to come together here. I'm letting my strokes be a lot softer on the left-hand, right-hand side, as you can see, because that's just going to direct the viewer more so to the middle, which is what we want. I'm also adding a hint of blue into these darker applications that we've left from before. Now we'll get even closer, get a little bit of red, hint of our blue. We want this to be mostly pink, lots of titanium white, like that. Just slowly building it up. And then I'm going to look for that brightest area, find some openings, and we'll just splash in some hints of this really nice highlight. We'll start out in this middle area, and then we might work our way to the left and right slightly. But I'm trying to avoid the blue for the most part, unless I feel like there's too much blue in one area, in which case this can kind of go over it. It's going to look like a really nice shine and added detail. Up close, it'll just look like a lot of brush strokes. But again, that's why it's so important to look at your painting both up close and from afar. There we go. You can see how I'm running out of pigment as I move towards the left, and that's exactly what you want. You can also connect a couple of these. Good. We can also take a little bit of that pink, work it back up here. A couple little strokes, that way we have all of those cohesive colors. Going to use some water to soften little bits here and there. And I'll also take some orange, like this, make it much brighter. And I'll work some hints of that down into here as well. Let's take a couple of steps back and see what it looks like from a little bit of a distance. So here we have a bit of a wider shot, and isn't it amazing just how all of those little brush strokes blend together even when you take 2 feet back? I am loving how this is turning out, and I think what we're going to do now is just to continue bringing up the highlights in here that we want, but now it is from a bit of an afar. So here I am taking more of my blue. I'm sitting farther away from the painting, and I'll grab a little bit of red too, a little bit of Mars Black, but I do want to work on this now from a distance. That might mean holding your brush like this instead of like this. A lot of us naturally hold our brush like a pencil, but this is actually the more correct way of painting. I hate using that term just because I think that people should paint however they like to paint. I know incredible professional painters who like to paint holding it like a pencil. I spend a lot of time holding it like a pencil, but in an academic setting like in university or in my life drawing classes, it was generally recommended that we hold a brush like this. And the idea behind that is that you can stand farther away from your painting, and that way you can see how everything's working together and you don't get too caught up in a single area. So this is actually the first time in the lesson that I am painting with this grip, so don't feel like you have to do it. Just recognize that it is a great technique for painting with a lot of perspective and making sure that what you're doing is cohesive with everything else. There we go. It does make creating detail, I think, a little bit more difficult for people initially, but it is something you can get used to. And it's also neat because it allows you to create longer, more consistent strokes than holding it like a pencil does. So just another little tip, not something you have to follow, not something you have to do, but if you find that you're getting distracted by single areas and you want a more wide view, this is a great way of getting it. And I'm doing this now for all of those little detail areas. Still not using a truly bright pigment. And when I apply this, I'm working over darker pigments, so it's actually going to look darker because it's semi-transparent and those darker pigments are going to show through. So this is really just another good reminder that Even though it's a brighter part of the water and our painting, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bright. It's just bright relative to everything else that we have going on here. There we go. I'm also making the edges a little bit darker for that vignette effect. Here, this is really some of the first highlighted details I've incorporated on that side there, and I'm not going to do many others. Do a couple over here. Starting to run out of pigment. And I'm using my finger to wipe off excess pigment once in a while. Because it's so watery, it doesn't really leave much of a mark. But you are noticing that I'm having to use my finger more frequently because I am painting in this way, and it is a bit more loose. That's actually another great use for this style of painting, is when you do feel like your subjects are a bit tight or they don't have a lot of motion, it doesn't feel fluid. This is a great way of breaking out of that and making things just flow a little bit better. This is quite bright. I think I need to be very careful here. I'm going to switch back to this for a second. I'm just going to add hints of it. Little areas that are shining, which is kind of an artistic liberty because the light in this painting that's shining is warm. You're getting all of these reflective pinks and oranges, and the blues are actually shadow colors. They're like the pigment at the top of the sky. It's when the light isn't hitting it, it's the cool side of the subject, and that's because the wave is obviously facing in the opposite direction of the light. So when you add like a real highlight or a shine in blue, it doesn't make that much sense. But again, I'm a big fan of taking artistic liberties. If you feel like what you're doing can add to the piece, then why not? And honestly, we're not making it that bright to the point where it does look like it's shining. It is just the primary highlight of that area. So I wouldn't worry about it if you decide to make things bright, but recognize if you make them very bright, call it an artistic liberty. And you know what? I think that's A-okay in my book. There we go. Maybe I'll add a hint of it back here, just a little bit, keep it cohesive. That worked really well. I like that. Good. Okay, now when we move into the sand here, we're going to need to make a transition from this and this into it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time working on the finer details right here on the edge because I'm going to have to paint over this probably twice. So what I'm going to do right now is actually probably go have a little bit of a snack. I've been painting for a couple hours. It's important to stay hydrated, make sure that you're eating. You know, you'll be a lot happier if you are, you'll be less irritable, and your painting, I'm sure, will be significantly better for it. So I'm going to go have a snack. I'm going to clean my water, my brushes, then when we come back to this, we'll work on this area right in here, work on the reflections in the sand, and do some really, really beautiful things. So I will see you in a couple of seconds, but this is your friendly reminder to, make sure you're drinking water, staying healthy while you paint, and I'll see you in a second. So now we're going to take our large flat 1-inch headed brush. We are going to take a little bit of titanium white, quite a bit of cerulean blue, and then about half the amount of blue in Mars Black. We'll mix this up to get a very dark grayish blue, and I do need quite a bit of this because it's going to be the color of our sand, which I know may seem a little bit strange, but it's important to remember, generally subjects' colors are augmented quite greatly by the colors in the sky and all of the reflective light. And in this piece we have a lot of blues, pinks, purples, and because the sand is wet, it's going to be heavily affected by that. It's going to reflect a lot of that light. So I'm just starting right down here. I'm working my way around the water that's going to be rolling in here. These are the ends of our waves, but we are going to have a lot of water that's washing up, and that's where it's all going to be. I'm doing this first because I want this water to layer on top of what we're currently doing. And so I'm going to go over that area just a little bit. I'm also going to try to create a slightly softer edge, as you can kind of see right here. That way, if the edge of this application isn't as thick as we may want it to be, we don't have a hard edge here showing through. So I'll just take some pigment off my brush and then I'll go over this lightly. See that? I'm just using a damp brush. The blend doesn't have to be perfect. You can see some brush strokes in there, I'm not worried about that. And now we need to build up our layers a bit. I want it to be a little bit darker. So I'll add some extra Mars Black, titanium white, get a little bit more blue. So the great thing about having to do multiple layers with acrylics, the more layers you do, the more of a chance you have to change things, try different things out, make them how you really want them to be. Now I'm going over it a couple times with some very soft strokes, just to make sure I get a smooth application and there aren't any noticeable brush strokes. Might add a hint of red into this, and I'll just throw that about. Add some extra Mars Black on the brush, which is now working its way into the sand here. I am okay with that. I actually do like it as dark as it is. Maybe we'll get a little bit more red, a little bit more white. Oh, that's pretty. So now I'm just going to let this dry, and then we'll come back in and start working on the reflections up above. So now we're going to begin here in the reflections in the brightest part, which again is right down here. This is going to have a lot of similar colors that we have in there, and I'm going to continue to use the larger brush. So yet again, we'll start with some of our cadmium red light hue, cadmium yellow deep hue, and quite a lot of titanium white. Mix those up right here. We don't currently have any blues on our brushes or wet on the canvas, so we don't really have to worry about jumping into more yellow mixes initially. So here you can see I'm really spreading that about, finding something I'm quite happy with, and we'll give this a try. I think that is very bright, very beautiful. It'll probably get a little bit darker when we start mixing it into other pigments, like the blues and the reds that we'll have around here. So I'm okay with this being as dominant as it is right now. And I'm just going to move this out in a way that I feel like it'll reflect. And I'm also just looking over at the reference photo for the intricate little details like what you see I'm currently working with here. There we go. So, step one, done. I will take some of that pigment off my brush, and now I'll mix up a purplish red. So I'll grab some red, about a quarter of that in blue, some titanium white, about an equal mixture of Mars Black. Now we have a really nice desaturated grayish red, which I'll work right in here. This color is actually quite similar to what we have in the water, and it's really nice and cohesive. I will try to get a bit of a soft blend between the two pigments, but at this point that really isn't my goal. I just kind of want to block in where these colors are going to be, and then we can refine them and their edges a little bit later on. Then I'm going to make this a bit more blue. Add a hint of extra titanium white and Mars black. And we'll throw that over on the other side. So these two pigments are quite similar, but they do lean in different directions, and that makes them really quite interesting. Makes it so when you look at one side of the painting, you don't feel like you figured out the other side. And again, if you can get a little bit of a blend between these two, that's great. If not, that's okay. I still do have some of that orangey peach, which I can throw in there. And like I said, that peach was very bright initially, but the more we work around it, the darker it's going to get. Let's get you a little bit closer for the next step. Now we're going to take more of the blue, but we want it to be a little bit darker. So I'm adding some extra Cerulean blue and Mars black into the mixture, though I'm not adding any extra white. And I'll take this, start working from the right hand side, blend it into the softer blue that we have right there. And I'll just work that almost until the edge. Again, I do want a relatively soft blend here, but it's not imperative. Just going back and forth with a damp brush, trying to kind of revitalize some of that almost dry pigment. I'll grab more of this, head on over here. Again, we want this to blend. Probably won't with the drier pigments, but we can work on top of it. And we might be able to grab a little bit of this, work that in, and we are. Excellent. You can see that I'm getting a bit more loose with the colors at this point. And we're getting this nice kind of glassy effect because of it. I want my next mixture to be a little bit brighter. And we'll add a hint more blue. And I'm making this next mixture brighter, despite the fact that it's in the foreground with these darker areas, because now I'm mixing the blue for the front middle here. And remember, this is the dominant light spot. So I'll mix this right around our pink, our peach, our orange. That specific mixture changed quite a bit in this lesson. It's been fun to work with. Continuously grabbing more of that and just hoping that we get those blends. There it is again. Wonderful. We'll definitely have to go back over it with something brighter again and expand it because we have lost a lot of the size in the process, but that's okay. Everything we've made looks really quite nice. Now we're going to mix a pigment that's really dark, quite similar to this, and start working it into the water for areas that don't have enough water to really reflect this light and therefore are just the darker sand that is wet. So Mars black, a little bit of red, much more blue than red, a little bit of titanium white, there we go. I'm mixing it on top of our previous mixture, that way I can see the similarities. There we go. I think that's probably a little bit too dark. Add some titanium white. Going to let that dry just a little bit, so working on top of it will be easier. This, as you can see, is brighter, arguably significantly. Okay, we'll go back over this. There we go. If you hear me tripping on my words a little bit, would like to note that this is now the next day. I did take a little bit of a break, and generally when I start filming these, I haven't talked for quite a while. So it's just kind of getting used to that again. Again, always talk about it. I think some people really like to cut that sort of thing out, but I just think it makes the lessons much more honest. Recognize that we're not all, perfect at everything all the time, and that's okay. Actually, on the note of kind of talking to people and presenting, my partner and I last night, we watched an episode of Friends where Ross Geller, if you're familiar, he's teaching at a university, and it's his first time. He's nervous, and he starts speaking with just a very odd British accent. He isn't British, so it's really, really quite funny. But I do think about things like that, how initially when you start recording or talking to an audience, generally it takes a minute to adjust to your normal way of speech, your normal cadence, the normal nomenclature you use. And it was just quite enjoyable. Getting a little off topic here. Okay, I need more pink right here. Blend those. We finally found the darker pigment I wanted. And now I'm just trying to make it look a little bit more soft. It almost blends into here, as you can see, which is really quite nice. Now I think I do want more of that pinkish orange, so I'll grab some red, some yellow. I do need to be careful now with the yellow because we've been working with a lot of blues. There I have a very strong pink. Move that over. Rather than trying to work a massive amount of white into here and change it, I'm going to work with a smaller amount of pink, as it will be a lot easier to manipulate. Now I'll work a bit of yellow in there. Work it back into this area, and there we have a really nice mixture. So throw that right here. Move it out in all of the ways that we had it before. A little bit right there. And now we're refining. So I'm going to take all of that pigment off my brush, make my brush just a little bit damp, and now I'll go towards the edges, and I'll just blend this out very softly, applying very minimal amounts of pressure. That way we get that nice glassy look. Going over these areas many times. Head back over here. There we go. You can see that I'm starting to work with a little bit of a circular stroke. I do find that really can help in just moving things around consistently rather than getting a lot of streaks if you're having issues moving something. Get a little bit more. I'm going to leave a small space there and then just start with a little bit. See that in the reference photo? I think it's quite pretty, and we'll incorporate that as well. Still have a little bit too much paint there on my brush. So take that off. Might do some finger painting. Oh, that worked really well. Okay, definitely recommend finger painting for this section. Haven't done a reflection like this in a while, so a lot of it is just me trying things out right now and getting back in the groove. Really like it so far, though. I think I'm going to switch to my smaller, pointed, rounded brush, and we'll start incorporating some detail. So for this, I think we'll begin with a highlighted grayish blue. So grab some blue, some white, and some Mars black. There we go. I think we'll come along to the edge here, and there isn't a hard edge in the reference photo, so I'm not going to make a consistently hard edge, but I'm going to add a little bit of one. So I'll work my way right around here where we're going to receive a lot of light. Grab more pigment. I'll skip an area, and I might do some little taps over here, like that. Just a couple over here. It's all very soft, semi-transparent. Start working a couple back in the area that has all of that light. And you can work this over multiple colors, which is what's really going to make it interesting. I'm also going to create a couple little lines going towards us, showing that there is some separation in the sand and the water right there. And that can of course move back over the pink. Really want to do a cityscape one day in this palette right here. Just think it could be really incredible. I think I'll add some highlighted blue over here. And right now, these are things that I really wouldn't consider doing myself, but I see them in the reference photo and I say, okay, you know what? That's a real thing. Makes sense. I'll give it a shot. We'll see if it translates well to paint, because sometimes things you see in photos don't, and you do need to make changes, but it's interesting. I like the idea of it. So we'll play. Now I'm going to make it a little bit darker, and we'll start working it a little bit farther back in the water. I suppose at this point we should also note that this is turning into a very long lesson. I would be incredibly surprised if we weren't over the 2-hour mark now. So to everyone still watching, congratulations. I think that is a real sign that you are invested, that you're really trying to learn, that you are looking for ideas, not just in the beginning, but you're sticking it out, and I think that's wonderful. I think that's really how you grow, and I think there's a lot of honor to be had there. So congratulations to all of you who are still watching the lesson. I guess we need a new word for those of you who got this far. Write it in the comments. What word will we go with? You know what? I think this time we'll go with pinkish orange. Not a single word, not an actual word, but I just see so much of it in this painting, and I think it's something you can easily work into a sentence or a comment. So if you've made it this far, when you're leaving a comment today, type pinkish orange so I know that you did. Kind of like to keep track of these things. So, it can be a little humble brag in the comments that you got this far. That only we will know about. That's really nice. Starting to build in that detail. That's just bringing it all together. You can see that I'm just working these lines. Some of them are more opaque than others. I'm starting by making them not so opaque. That way I have time to change them if I want to. And here you can see, because I have so much water on my brush, I'm really able to change these lines. It's working quite well. Make them more thin. And if I don't like them, I can just use a lot of water on my brush and work that out. Just like that. I think I'm probably going to take a 2-minute break, really look at my reference photo and figure out what I want to do from here. There's definitely a couple of things that I know I want to incorporate in the painting. I just think I should probably take some time to prioritize what those may be. With that said, I did just have another idea that I do want to do right now, and that's make a dark mixture similar to what we have here, but just a hint darker. I'm going to go along the right hand edge here, along the highlights, and just build that up a little bit more. You see it in the reference photo and I love it. I'll also add it right underneath the highlights that we have right here. That way it looks like there's a little bit of a shadow being cast. Really, really nice. Okay, so I'm going to take a 2-minute break, think about things, prioritize, probably clean my water and my brushes, and then we'll be right back with some more detail work, because we've actually covered the entirety of the canvas, which is something I always feel like it's a big accomplishment. I always feel great about that. But from now on, we are working on the details. So here we have a little bit of a wider shot, and what I've come to the conclusion of is the next step that I'd really like to do is I'd like to work back in along this line and create a good transition from this water into this very calm reflection right here. So we're going to hop back into this with the smaller pointed brush and continue working with some cool blues. So now we are a little bit closer. I'm going to grab some of our blue, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit more Mars black, and we'll see if this is a bright enough highlight. Seems to be, like that a lot. So now I'm going to look for the bottom of all of these little swoops that we made with blue, and I'm going to start creating a consistent bridge between all of them. Now this is going to be essentially a line, but it's going to be full of little bumps and turns, and I essentially want it to feel like, okay, the water falls, it kind of hits here, maybe it works its way out a little bit, and that's another detail we can add. We can take some of these highlights and just create some line work, like that. But essentially, we're grabbing that pigment, following this down to the bottom. It's a little bit too bright. There we go. We'll start again. This one, we'll follow it to the bottom, then we'll have it hit, it'll go out a little bit, and then it'll work its way back until it hits this one, which is a little bit in front of it, so we'll move that a little bit in front. We'll work it back. This one, maybe it's farther back so it just connects. This one will move out. And I'll also do a little bit of a tap and a little bit of a swirl for my technique. And you can also take some of these highlights, if they are a little bit brighter than the rest of your blues, work them on top and back down. And I'll let it be really soft over on the edges so that we don't bring too much attention to them. Now I'll head back into those highlights, work a bit more of that water out here, really soften it as it gets far away, but keep it a bit more dense as it's right up close. It almost looks like it's coming off of a rock, which is a neat look. Always nice when different people can take different things away from your paintings. There we go. So I'm doing the same thing over on the left-hand side. Following these down, bringing them back, bringing them out occasionally. Now I'm heading back farther down, and I want to play with this area a little bit because I really like this pinkish peach we have, and I think we could move it through some of this. It's a great highlight. And just in the same way we worked the blue strokes over multiple colors, we can work this pink highlight over multiple colors. And I'm going to start moving it forward like this, so it works its way around this area that doesn't have as much water. Then once I have those applied, I'm going to take the extra pigment off my brush. I'll come back in with a damp brush, and I'll just blend out the back edges, keeping the area that's facing us a little bit sharper. This will make it look a little bit softer and more natural. Grab a bit more. Oh, that's nice. We're at that point where everything's just kind of working out and coming together. Take a bit more of that pink highlight, work it over here a little bit. Just little taps. Here we're building detail at this point. And I'm working this in between different blue strokes and darker strokes, and really all of the more prominent applications that we have in that area. I'll also do the same right over here. And a little bit back here as well. So we're taking something that looked great, but a little simple, and we're just building on it. See how I saw that darker line and then I worked my way around it on both sides? And now I'll blend it into the blue. I'll work it this way. I'll create those soft edges. Connect this to that a little bit more. Again, have a smooth transition into this. This is where we really want to think about where we're applying these strokes. We're saying, is that area a little too simple? Could that use a bit more highlight? Could it be darker? Do I need to balance this with the other side of the painting? Do I need to finger paint? Like that. I think this is a little bit brighter than the pigment we have, so I might even work a little bit of detail on top of this middle area. Also grab a bit of our darker pigment, which I need to remix. Blue, hint of red, quite a bit of black, and then not too much titanium white, but enough to make sure that it isn't exceedingly dark. And I'll work a little bit of a dark pigment back into here. Softly, just separate things. Maybe I'll find it connecting over into this through a long strand. Again, we're just trying to make the piece cohesive and make all of these colors and values feel like they are connected in a way. So now we've kind of bridged these two through that. We've moved this out to the left and the right hand side. We've taken the blues on the side. We've worked them in through the more horizontal strokes. And we're softening a lot of this with this round brush because it doesn't have any real hard edges. It has a point, but you can still work and create very soft applications with it. Also take a hint of a more highlighted blue with a hint of red, like that. Maybe a little bit more red. Better. Much better. And you can even work little bubbles washing up on the shore. Detail not a lot of people think to add, including myself, but again, saw it on the reference photo and I thought, you know what? That's a great little detail. So these are predominantly going to show up against the darker values because it's quite bright, but you can apply it elsewhere, and I do recommend applying it elsewhere a little bit to a point. That way, if you do notice, it feels like it's all working in the same way. But this is incredibly subtle. We don't want a lot of it. It's just something to further capture that attention once it's there. You can see I'm working a little bit of it back up here. Maybe I'll do one at that far, but that's about as far as I'm willing to go. You can even put a couple right down here on the sand. If you don't like these, quite easy to take off. As this isn't a gradient, it's a very easy pigment to just paint over. Now we're just going to take a little bit of our red, a little bit of our yellow, and a massive amount of our white, and we're going to try to create the brightest highlight we've used in the water. Then we're going to make it a little bit brighter from there. I'm going to head up to where the light is connecting. I'm just going to work a little bit of this back and forth in the middle here. You can tell that I'm skipping areas. We'll do some blends. I just want to brighten it up a little bit, add some extra diversity, create some additional horizontal lines, and just give it a little bit more depth through reflection. So here we're getting closer, so I'm making smaller little strokes. Occasionally they're connecting. Remember that the more you brighten pigment with titanium white, the less it will saturate it. So we're not trying to create something too bright. I still want it to have that really nice orange peach pigment, but we're certainly stretching what we did before. There we go. So, to conclude this painting, I'm just heading back up into the sky with the smaller pointed round-headed brush and a little bit of pinkish orange. My brush is extremely wet, and I'm just trying to create some very transparent edges right along our sides. I'm also trying to use a lot of brush strokes that are angled in this way so that we get a little bit of a wispy look, and it looks like there's some real movements up here. Makes it really dynamic, gives us some leading lines pointing in towards the center of the painting, and these layers are incredibly thin. I'm really happy with what we have, and I don't want to kind of hinder that, so I'm using an incredibly small amount of paint and a lot of water. But with that, this really is the conclusion of the painting, so I would like to say a big thank you to you for making it this far and, for continuing to just watch and support the channel. This has been a real pleasure. In all of these seascapes, I feel like I learned something really new and interesting. This one, it was definitely this bottom section here with the reflections and that incredibly thin layer of water. I've never done anything like this, and I only did it because the reference photo kind of pointed me in that direction, and I'm so glad it did, because I'm definitely going to incorporate that in future seascapes. And actually, speaking of future seascapes, this series is going incredibly well, getting a lot of warm reception, so I think we'll continue it next week. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe, but also more importantly, hit the bell button, because that will notify you when the new lesson goes live, and that way you don't miss a tutorial. Oh, I like that area a lot. That's a really nice area. With that said though, I'd also like to say a big thank you to all of the patrons who support this channel. As I noted earlier, this channel is primarily fan-funded. It is because of you that we are able to keep the lights on and make these each and every week. So thank you for supporting myself, thank you for supporting art in general, and really for providing everybody with these lessons. It's incredibly kind of you, and you know, I can't tell you how grateful I am. Honestly, when I say this at the end of the videos, I lose the words. So just thank you. With that, if you would also like to help support the channel, there is a link in the description to the Patreon, where of course you can get the traceables, the reference photos, a back catalog of a bunch of bonus videos, all 5 of my ebooks, individual art critiques, access to our exclusive Facebook group. This used to be incredibly hard to say. I felt like I was just listing things one after another, but I think we've made enough lessons where I'm finally starting to get a hang of it. So you can go and you can check all of that out if you are interested, but really thank you for making it this far. I do really look forward to reading the comments, everyone saying pinkish orange, I believe it was. But yeah, this was a real pleasure. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for stopping by, and above all, as always, stay creative.